Yujiro Hanma, also known as the strongest creature on Earth. A man so mighty that he exists as a mythological figure within a story where characters regularly jump from buildings or punch holes through concrete walls. He is canonically regarded as the most powerful fighter in the Bakiverse, and the entire lore surrounding the series seems to support that idea. But underneath all that muscle and legendary feats of strength, there exists a more mysterious side to that man. A side that is perfectly represented by his second nickname, that of the Ogre. To some, this appellation would appear as being a simple nudge towards his formidable appearance or violent behavior. But there is something much deeper and sinister behind that moniker. An entire subconscious iceberg of hidden meanings that adds strong symbolic relevance to the story, and explains a lot of Itagaki's plot points and narrative choices. An ogre, in European folklore, is a creature depicted as a large and monstrous-looking man, showcasing a level of muscularity and strength that far surpasses that of which a normal healthy body should be capable of. In a sense, they could be perceived as figures of heroic caliber, if they didn't have the unfortunate habit of feasting on human flesh. These entities have existed in every single country and culture throughout history under different forms, such as Onis in Japanese folklore or Umbaba in ancient Mesopotamian religion, and have received multiple literary adaptations, like Grendel from Beowulf, Polyphemus from the Odyssey, or even the Beast from Beauty and the Beast. All of these iterations of the myth take on different appearances and characteristics, but their symbolic content remains similar. While sometimes depicted as giants, they remain a humanoid species that is closer to man than it is to beasts. They are capable of thought, speech, and reason, but the way they choose to interact with the world around them is distinctly antisocial. Since we have absolutely no tangible proof that such creatures ever existed, we can only surmise that ogres were a representation of fears endured by populations at the time, and conceptualized under the form of a specific class of non-humans, which is often the case with monsters like the figures of the vampire or werewolf attest to. In that case, the exuberant power and reckless aggression displayed by these titanic entities could be interpreted as a personification of mass violent strife, such as pogroms, wars, or military raids. More generally, it also speaks to the apprehension that most felt at the time regarding the loss of their children at the paws of animals or some other types of danger. The fear of this mortal threat stemming from the idea of a superior energy being able to conquer and consume those weaker than itself, with no regards for moral conventions or human decency. This interpretation is correlated by the fate that ogres most often encounter in stories, usually getting outsmarted by a human and defeated by brains rather than bronze, illustrating the desire of resolving conflict through something else than power or military might, since the average peasant possessed neither. This makes those creatures into calamities of sorts, that can be contained but not faced, and who represent an unsurmountable obstacle, impossible to overcome with physical strength alone, as this is the one domain where they possess a natural born advantage that stems from their very nature as beasts in the shape of man. In that context, the nickname Ogre fits Yujiro Hanma to a T, which in that case stands for testosterone. He is the most muscular character in Grappler-Baki, and his strength is only later challenged by monsters of his caliber such as Oliva, Pico, and Musashi, who themselves represent mythological creatures or power archetypes. He is obsessed with combat and has dedicated his life to fighting, going as far as to participate in several wars in order to fulfill his lust for destruction. This almost pathological addiction to violence was in him from infancy and kept growing the more he fed it. which is similar to the figure of an ogre who grows ever so hungry the more victims he consumes. While Yujiro never actually dines on the corpse of his victims, he can be heard saying numerous times in the series that he wants to devour strong fighters, a lexical choice that I believe to be purely intentional on Itagaki's part. It can also be noted that his son, Jack Hanma, literally bites and chews on the flesh of his opponents, and has an entire backstory dedicated to him becoming a monster. However, he is no genuine ogre, as he required the use of drugs and surgical interventions to grow his body into a hulking mass of nightmarish muscles, while his father is a natural-born savage. As a result, Jack was never able to hold a candle to him, whereas Baki did, his second son from a much purer union, who managed to muster enough techniques and skills to make up for the gap in power. His older brother having made the mistake of banking it all on strength alone, which is a strategy that never seems to work against ogres and explains his failures. Regarding children, there is an obvious parallelism to be made between Yujiro and the Titan Kronos, who heard through a prophecy that he was destined to be dethroned by his own sons, spurring him to eat each and every one of them after their birth to prevent his demise. He himself was the offspring of Uranus, that he castrated and dispatched in order to replace him as ruler of the universe. A story that closely mimics the tumultuous paternal feuds entangling the Hanma family, as their blood seems to be destining them to an endless amount of parricide wars. An history that is documented in hieroglyphs, going back thousands of years and which manifests itself under the form of the demon back, a genetic trait that paints the features of an ogre's face on their body. As such, the justification offered by Yujiro for his murderous behavior towards his sons is the excitation that he feels at the thought of claiming their life in a one-on-one battle, which also aligns with a behavior traditionally attributed to ogres, consisting in them preferring to devour their own children rather than those of others. This would explain why Yujiro went through the struggle of impregnating women to then patiently raise the resulting kids as warriors. Since his enjoyment can only come from a battle with a worthy adversary, this very process would be the equivalent of wanting to savor a home-cooked meal rather than eating at a local joint. This particularity of his can be seen all throughout the series, as he never enjoys himself more than when fighting those that he has specifically handpicked for combat through revenge, making sure that they would seek him out and try to enact vengeance without fail, going as far as to perpetrate acts of incredible cruelty to make sure that his face would remain engraved in his victims' brains. On a subconscious level, one could also think that by antagonizing them, he cultivates the possibility of his son surpassing and defeating him, which is ultimately what the mythology surrounding the battle between Kronos and Zeus demonstrates. And speaking about the god of lightning, it is interesting to see that Yujiro follows a similar philosophy to that of the ruler of the sky when it comes to reproduction, having literally spread his seed all throughout the world and creating a race of demigods in the process, of which Baki is the most successful representative. In a sense, their relationship is incredibly similar to that of Zeus and Hercules, but that will be the focus of another video. To get back on the topic of ogres, it is important to precise that in the folklore, they seem to exclusively consume male infants, cementing them as personifications of war, but also confirming that Yujiro is in line with the preferences of his would-be species, as he is only really interested in fighting other men and seems to show a particular interest in young and developing individuals, not unlike the figure of Hisoka from Hunter x Hunter, which could also make for an interesting video topic comparing these two characters and their quirks/similarities. From 1292, Italian literature described ogres as beings who eat little boys, which, if we refer back to the symbolic nature of most creatures of those days, indicates that their very existence in tales and stories can be interpreted as a warning for parents of young children. At a time when infant mortality was still incredibly prevalent, the loss of a child was a possibility that parents had to constantly keep in mind. Especially since this tragedy could be caused by their own inability to provide their offspring with enough food to survive. The figure of the Ogre, whose semi-human form makes it both a foreign and familiar personification of insatiable hunger and potential famine, represents that dual threat which loomed over the head of every child back then. Those that made it through were the tough ones of the pack, able to survive the bicephalic boogeyman of violence and starvation, not through strength, but rather via resilience and planning. In a sense, ogres represented the occurrence of difficult life events, being both unavoidable and relentless. Just like Yujiro embodies the concepts of adversity and struggle in Baki, always showing up unexpected to offer a challenge that cannot be refused. To survive an encounter with him, you need to be interesting enough to pique his curiosity, as the weak or boring get squashed immediately. Just like the ogres of tales, he offers an unsurmountable physical challenge to face, one that can only be won via avoidance or strategy, direct confrontation being entirely out of the question. Most characters of the Bakiverse are smart enough to follow those directives, save for a few that are crazy enough to confront the ogre directly. Both Jack and Baki had their face ravaged by their dad during their fight, the former entering a coma that required months to emerge from, and the second almost dying, his head crushed by the formidable fist of his janitor. He was protected by his mother, who elected to sacrifice her life to save his, reflecting the tale of Rhea, who hid Zeus from Cronus until he was ready to defeat his father. It also establishes a strong parallelism between Yujiro and the figure of Bluebeard, a man famous for his cruelty, who made a point of murdering his wives if they ever dared to disobey him. This is an aspect of the character that fits perfectly within the theme of the Ogre, which are often represented under the form of domineering tyrants who lead their spouse and children with an iron fist, not hesitating to kill those who wouldn't follow their orders. When it comes to literary ciphers, one can also cite Humbaba, whose head was placed in a leather bag after having been defeated by Gilgamesh, which is exactly what Yujiro did to the Yasha ape, reinforcing the idea that those themes have been placed there by Itagaki as hints to help the reader unveil the ogre's true nature. Interestingly enough, Humbaba was said to have the visage of a lion, his face scribed in a single line like that of the cold entrails of man and beast, creating a look of death that would terrify anyone who would be subjected to it. This description fits Yujiro's battle grin perfectly, and applies to most classical ogres who are often described as having feline facial features. It is easy to see why big cats would be used as models for these monsters, as they are both unpredictable and deadly, two qualities that Yujiro also possesses. There are multiple passages in the manga when his aura and swagger are represented by the image of a lion, and his mane of hair and sharp teeth only reinforce that impression. An abundant head of hair also happens to be characteristic of ogres, although most didn't just have long locks, but are also covered in fur, while Yujiro is clean-shaven, showing him under a more presentable and charismatic light. The untamable mane of the strongest creature on Earth, which, as you've noticed, is never referred to as a man, is a sign of his intense vitality and endless youth, ogres remaining strong and nimble way into their old age, marking them as abnormal as well as eternal. The abnormal similarities don't stop here, as they are also described as having unusually colored skin, often being darker than a normal human. which is also the case for Yujiro, a characteristic that the manga never really covers or explains, passing off what I believe to be an important clue as being an idle detail of character design. I could also cite the voracious appetites of ogres, with Yujiro eating enough food to feed 20 persons in one sitting. Ogre comes from the French, meaning that which consumes flesh. Yujiro, in his essence, is like a black hole of energy, constantly attracting to him women and men alike that he will devour for his enjoyment. As a being of supreme violence, he is often short-tempered and has no time for words, correlating with the lonely existence that most ogres seem to live, often being depicted as solitary creatures who reject the company of others through their violent antisocial behavior. A tendency also showcased by Yujiro, who spends the vast majority of his time alone. This trait of character would slowly vanish the closer his son got to him in terms of fighting prowess and paternal bond, as if managing to tame the mythological terror. Just as teenagers stop fearing the boogeyman, Baki realizes as he ages that his father isn't as terrible as he thought he was, showing that the horrors of yesterday were mostly caused by a lack of agency and experience, and not necessarily by the gravity of the threat at hand. In that respect, ogres also represent a great filter, the metaphysical expression of natural selection that sorts through children and only lets the most capable through. Just like Yujiro only spares those in which he sees potential. Their existence is an allegory of the growth that occurs when surmounting the difficulties of the wood, where a boy knows he turned into a man when he isn't afraid of them anymore. This is where the etymology of the word takes its full meaning, as its root comes from the biblical term Og, literally last of the giants. Yujiro is the sole survivor of a dying breed of beings whose entire existence revolves around devouring others, but which also tragically cannot find pleasure in the consumption of anything that isn't their own blood, leading them to continually seek multiplication, a phenomenon occurring in real life through cycles of unbroken conflict, leading young men who are traumatized by violence to becoming ogres themselves. In Grappler Baki, it is more literal, as Yujiro grew up on the battlefield and is constantly either hunting or encouraging people to seek him out for fights. But the result is the same. The ogre is the one that drives the story forward, as every main character seeks to get stronger in order to defeat him. And just like in our world, we're constantly trying to use violence to defeat threats against the familiar always creates wars. The multiple attempts at facing off against Yujiro in the manga only lead to a multiplication of violence and propagation of brutality, as the figure of the ogre, which represents the ferocity that is intrinsic to our world, cannot, by definition, disappear.